Hi, I'm Katie Tamlin, and welcome back to EcoDev. Today we are talking about food choice and how we can make choices regarding the food that we purchase and the food that we consume that are slightly more sustainable. So, if we look at the different types of farming methods that are employed to make the food that we eat, the most common and the most, frankly, efficient and productive from a purely crop yield point of view is often intensive types of agriculture. And by intensive agricultural practice, we're referring to high levels of mechanization, single crop. So, having like acres and acres and acres of just wheat or just soy so that you can get efficient use of machines, and having the same crop over and over and over again. These sorts of methods of farming have impacts on the local ecosystems. And there are a number of scientific studies that show how intensive agriculture over the last 50 years is having a negative impact on our soil, on our environment, and on the living things in the ecosystems that are impacted. So, as an example, 16% of global soils are estimated to have a lifespan of 100 years or less simply due to erosion. And intensive agriculture is highly associated with higher erosion levels. So things like tilling, not having cover crops or not having any crops, having bare soil at certain times of year. Those sorts of things increase the likelihood of erosion, and of course that can have a negative impact on soil availability and soil, and of course crop yields as a result. The other major area is in the chemicals that we have to use to farm intensively. So if you are undertaking intensive agricultural farming, typically that's associated with having to artificially amend your soil. So as you plant the same crop over and over and over again, the nutrients that crop requires and takes from the soils are depleted. When you rotate crops and you have cover crops, then you can often return nutrients to the soil by having a cover crop and then using that crop or other wastage crops as compost. You can return nutrients to the soil, and by switching out which crops you're farming, often you can balance the nutrients that are put back in the soil with the nutrients that are taken out. However, when you are intensively farming the same crop on the same plot of land over and over and over again, it's taking the same nutrients out in every cycle. So you have to artificially amend the soil to be able to support that crop over time. And that means chemical fertilizers. So there's broad consensus that the maximum safe limit of nitrogen, for example, in fertilizer that we should be putting into the soil globally is about 62 million tons. And that the natural safe limit of phosphorus we should be putting into the soil globally is about 6 million tons. Currently, we're running at twice that. And we're still seeing global crop yields come under pressure for a number of reasons. So I think we're facing a situation where this intensive agricultural farming practice is starting to experience diminishing returns. Crop yields are struggling. We're having to put more amendments into the soil. We're having to manually pollinate certain crops in areas where there's been such great soil health and biodiversity loss that pollinators simply cannot perform the jobs that they're there to perform. So all of these things that are associated through much scientific study with intensive agricultural practice impact our environment, and frankly will have an impact on future food production. So we need to be conscious of these and kind of getting out in front of these areas before we find global food shortages becoming more and more of a reality. When you have that intensive agricultural farming practice in place, not only do you have to put a lot of soil amendments in, like nitrogen and phosphorus, but you also typically have to use a lot of pesticides or herbicides. So these are poisons that are designed to reduce pests, thus the name. Those could be weeds, they could be insects that like to eat those plants, it could be lots of things. So, if we think about the types of foods that we can buy that will encourage farming practices that promote biodiversity and promote soil health, then you're looking at organic food and vegetables. I certainly have speak a lot about the frustration that organic fruit and vegetable is more expensive. It is frustrating. It's frankly because it is less efficient when you don't have the same crop being, being harvested by machines over lots and lots of land. But it is better for the soil. It is better for biodiversity and better for our environment to not rely on pesticides and not necessarily to be able, with the technology that we have today, to harvest mechanically. So, if we look at organic food production, one of the ways that you can encourage speaking of biodiversity, the third area in which we are going to talk about the impact that our food choices have on sustainability is around biodiversity specifically. There is a lot of focus on biodiversity at the moment. The science is pretty unmistakable. Species are dying at 1,000 times the rate that they did before humans were on this planet, and at 10 times the rate that's deemed safe by the scientific community. Wildlife populations have fallen by 69% since 1970. We are losing pollinators at a rate that is making it virtually impossible to be able to rely on natural pollination in future. So we are seeing humans having to pollinate plants manually in areas where the populations of natural pollinators, insects, birds, would normally carry out that function, and that is worrying. It's worrying altruistically because, of course, we will struggle to rebuild those populations if these trends continue. But it's also worrying in a selfish perspective because it's going to impact crop yields. It's simply not as efficient to have people walking around pollinating different plants as it would be to have ants or bees or birds pollinating those plants for us. So I think there's a real concern amongst the scientific community that losing those pollinators will certainly impact crop yields in future and the efficiency of food supply chains. So one of the things I like to think about in my food choices is how do we promote biodiversity? And we talked about farming methods, and certainly similar to the farming method choice, by choosing organically farmed food, then you can rest assured that there will be more of a positive impact on pollinators, on biodiversity in the soil, biodiversity in the land on which those items are farmed. I certainly recognize from my own limited gardening how frustrating it is to lose a crop, however big or small, to a pest. I have battled slugs in my garden, plenty, and plenty of other animals that like to eat the things that I grow. And I can't even imagine what it's like for farmers who are trying to make ends meet and battling pests as well. So it's only natural that that when left entirely to free market forces, farmers are going to use pesticides in order to increase their yields and therefore increase their profit, especially if if they're being paid, pretty low prices for food, for the food and crops that they produce. So I think it's where we can and where budgets allow, choosing organic produce also ensures less pesticides are used in the production, if any. I mean, there are few circumstances in which organic farmers can use natural pesticides, but certainly you don't have the type of chemical additions to the environment when you are farming organically. And the lack of chemicals being pumped into the soil or into the air where crops are being produced means that the species living there, the birds, the insects, the worms, every part of that ecosystem is better protected from us. We're not inadvertently poisoning the pollinators when we try to control weeds, for example. And so by choosing goods that are produced organically, we have a double positive impact. One, less chemical fertilizers being needed because the soil remains more naturally healthy, and two, better biodiversity preservation in the soil, in the air, in the surrounds of where those items are farmed.